Okay, let's get started. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm Jennifer Rothschild. I am the director of the Educating Character Initiative. Welcome back to our fall webinar series. I hope everyone has had a great summer. I'm gonna do a little bit of housekeeping at the top of the hour before I get to our event today. I'm about to tell you some of the exciting events that we have coming up at the ECI. So please, if you want to stay in the loop on these, register for our Educating Character Initiative community on our website. Somebody will put the link in chat for you so that you will have that handy and you'll be able to get our newsletters and hear about all these things, reminders as they come up. So registration for our big conference in December, Educating Character Across Differences, is going to open in September. We're very excited about that. We're finalizing submissions, and I can tell you the lineup for this conference is going to be spectacular. We are also hoping to release the RFP for our next grant cycle in October. We currently are running or getting up and running, starting now, 3 different webinar series. One is that we are co-sponsoring a second series of the Flourishing Student webinar with the Jubilee Center. We don't have that on our website yet, but it will be up soon. We also are running an Educating Character Initiative Community Book Club, featuring 1 book a month and discussion about that book. All the books are by the authors that are going to be featured speakers at our December conference. So please join us for conversation about those. And then our third webinar series is this one that you're here for today. This is our equipment webinar series. So one of the missions of the Educating Character Initiative is to provide tools for educators that are interested in doing the work of character at their universities with their groups of students and doing whatever we can to support you in that work. And so this webinar is designed to give you some strategies, some ideas that you can take and put to work on your own campus. I can tell you that last year at the ECI, the question that I got more than any other question is how to do assessment and measurement. It comes up again and again. Even people who are deep in the work of character don't always know how to do assessment and measurement. So to that end, we are working to provide something for you in that slot. We have hired both a research specialist and a senior scholar of research and assessment on the ECI team. And the entire fall webinar series is devoted to this very topic. So we're really excited about that. We hope you'll join us for the whole series. We have a great lineup, and all of that is on our website. You can find details about the session. Okay, so looking forward to our session for today, and then I will introduce our speaker and turn it over to her. The way that we usually run this is that our speaker will have a little bit of time to talk as long as she wants, but we will have time for Q&A at the end. If you have questions that you would like to come up in the Q&A, put them in the box at the bottom for Q&A. The chat will also be enabled if you want to make connections with one another. Betsy may direct you toward adding some things to the chat at some point in her talk. So keep those things separate. The chat is for conversation during the event. The Q&A is for the end of her presentation when we'll have a discussion period. And I'm just so happy to have Betsy here for the first session in our How to Do Assessment and Measurement webinar for this fall. So this session is entitled Character Assessment in the University Classroom, the Value of Feedback for Teachers and Learners in Any Discipline. And the title really does say a lot about what's going to happen here. Betsy is fantastic at helping us think about how you don't have to be a data scientist to be able to make good use of assessment work in creating classrooms that are valuable for both faculty and the people in the room trying to learn the material. We're so happy to have her here. She is our assistant provost, and Executive Director of the Center for the Advancement of Teaching at Wake Forest University. And with that, Betsy, I'm just going to turn it over to you and let you take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here and to talk with you all. I run our teaching center at Wake Forest, but my academic background is in ethics, comparative ethics. And so I love the work that the Educating Character Initiative is doing. And I'm often talking with folks at different institutions in my role as a teaching center. And so it's great to be able to present to folks at a lot of different institutions who are trying to do this work. So I am going to start my presentation and share my screen for you all. So let me back up. Sorry, let me get this right. Start at the beginning and not in the middle. I was just, as Jennifer was talking, I thought, oh, I'm going to add a piece here of something I want to put in a slide. Always at the last minute doing this work. So, okay. All right, we're good now. We're going to get it started. Okay. Let's see. Okay. Okay, now we're good. All right, I'm going to share my screen and we'll go ahead and get started. Full screen, I think I will. Okay, so we're going to start. So character assessment in the university classroom, as Jennifer said, what we are, so that way you can't see all of this. There should be a way for me to make that full screen, and it's not. Interesting, it doesn't want to do that. That's fine. All right, you can see it there, so which is good. So, so the first thing to start with is just sort of think about what is assessment. And I'm sure that if I had you pause and we were in a room together and I had you think about what assessment is, you might have various things that come to mind. Depending on your role at the university, you might think, oh, that annoying thing those accreditors make us do. I have to somehow have learning outcomes in my syllabus, or I have to figure, or maybe you're thinking if you're working on really cool programs for your institution that somehow I have to have really good data to show the impact of our work, program evaluation to make sure that the university funds the work. There's a lot of different things you might be thinking about when you think about assessment. And my broad goal for today is really to get you to recognize, as Jennifer said, that assessment is not always for accreditation or program evaluation. We can think about assessment more broadly. So there are ways in besides the traditional work that some of us are doing for good reason. This is not to dismiss accreditation work and program evaluation work. It's also not just for academic research. So you may have folks in your institution, or there are folks that, the Program for Leadership and Character have hired who are trained specialists in doing academic research. They are social scientists. They know how to measure and they know how to design experiments to measure whether something caused something else and to analyze the data. But that's not the only place that assessment happens in higher ed. And so I want to talk a bit about that. And then finally, again, this point of it's not just designed and implemented by social scientists, that often a lot of us are doing it, whether we know how to do that work or not. And I want to give you some feelings that, oh, okay, there's still some things of value that I can do, even if I'm not a social scientist on that front. So I like to think about assessment with a very broad definition, that assessment is just a systematic process for understanding and documenting the state of students' learning and development. So I put development in there because if we're thinking about character, sometimes we don't often intuitively think about that as a form of learning. I think it is, but you can just put these two together, that, any sort of systematic process for figuring out where are students, how are they doing in the development of the goals that we have for them in our program or in our course. And so in that context, if you have that wide definition, I think it has been useful for me and for my colleagues to think about sort of three locations where assessment happens in higher ed, three places where it happens, and then some differences between these three. So the first would be the context of research. And this could be publishable research, it could be program evaluation research, but there are also other contexts where research might be helpful for us that we'll talk about in a bit. But the second, and probably, if I had asked you at the beginning of this webinar, where are the places that you think about assessment, you might have said exams. You might have said grading, right? So another place that we see in higher ed that we are doing assessment, not in the genre of program evaluation and measurement, but some sort of measurement here when we're grading our students' work and giving some sort of score for how they're doing in our classes. So grading is another context in which we do assessment. And then there's a third context in higher ed where we do assessment, which is when we give feedback to our students about how they're doing. And this is sometimes it comes tied to the grading. We're giving them a grade and then we give them a comment about how they're doing on their paper. But oftentimes we give feedback outside the context of a grade. We're saying, hey, you could work on this. You might, we're getting drafts. We're helping them understand how they can develop. We're sort of monitoring throughout the class. We see, oh, this student's really struggling here. I might reach out to them and have a conversation with them to give them feedback about how they can improve their work in the course. So these are three contexts for assessment that I'm going to talk through a little bit today. And then we'll talk about some of the challenges as well. And then I'll open it up to the floor. So we're gonna have a lot of time for your questions, and please feel free to put them in the chat as well, but we'll put your specific questions that you want Jennifer to ask me in the question box. So I think it is useful to think about who the audience of our assessment practices are for, because there's a variety of audiences in higher ed, and that's going to shape how we're doing assessment. And this can be linked to, so I have a table linked to the various sites of assessment. So here we might think, if we start with grading, who's the audience for our grades? Well, some people would say that the audience for the grades are employers. So, if the employers only have one job and they have to decide who they're going to give the job to, the purpose of the grade in this sense is to communicate to external bodies that the students are skilled or knowledgeable in these ways. They got an A, they got a B, et cetera, so that the employers can sort them, right? That's a very sort of crass but pragmatic way that the value of a grade. Same thing kind of happens internally. When we give grades, we often are communicating to other faculty. So if there's an upper level course that students can only get into if they have a C or above, we're saying, hey, they're ready for the next course. Or maybe graduate school, we're communicating to other faculty that they have done well, they have learned what they needed to learn in this undergraduate program, and so you can accept them into later program. And it's also the case that grades, obviously, one audience for the grades is students. We don't just give grades in secret. We usually show the students what their grades are, although we'll come back to talking about what the purpose is there for showing students their grades. In addition to that, we have research, and I think the audience for research could be researchers. So if I'm actually publishing in a scholarly journal, it's for other people who are curious, who want to learn more. For example, if you're doing research on the relationship between certain strategies and character growth, you may want to publish that so that all of us in this community can learn more about what we can do in our own institutions. But also the research can be more local. So it doesn't have to be this formal publishable research. You can also do program evaluation, whether that's, a program in character development, like the program for leadership and character, or just the philosophy major or the English major. You often see people doing program evaluation or accreditation. And the purpose of these reports that are written is to check boxes with these groups. So the administrators know that they should keep funding us, or the creditors say you should stay accredited. So it's really to say, look, we're doing our jobs. That's the purpose there. And then finally, you also can have an intended audience as instructors. And this is one I think we often don't think about, but sometimes it's really valuable for us as instructors in the classroom to do a little bit of research and think, I'm learning about my course and my students, and that's helping me become a better teacher. So it's not always just for external purposes that we're doing this kind of research assessment. It also can be for us as teachers. And then finally, obviously, the audience of feedback is the person we're giving feedback to. So in this case, in the case of the classroom, this would be students. So again, pretty straightforward. This maybe isn't anything radically new, but I think sometimes these categories help us keep things straight in our head because these can be very different processes. So the next question is, what are the purposes? And I've already sort of jumped into some of that, but here I have a little table to help us out here. So again, research, grading, and feedback, and then here are the various audiences we might be speaking to. So what is the purpose of doing assessment research for researchers? Well, that's pretty obvious. To provide insight into which programmatic and pedagogical strategies actually work, as I said, so we all can learn from each other in the field. Accreditors and administrators want to know if the program is working as they want it to. Should we keep funding that program or not, if that's our goal? But the instructors, so ourselves, what the value of this for us is that it helps us figure out whether students are learning in the aggregate so that we can adjust our pedagogical strategies. So if I see that all my students are getting Fs on something or they're really struggling, then I might want to adjust what I'm doing in my classes to make sure that they're learning well. Or if I see I did this accidental thing that I didn't think was that big of a deal and students loved it and learned a great deal, then maybe I want to be careful and write that down and say, I'm going to do that again next time. So being sort of monitoring what's happening in the classroom and what is leading to growth is itself really valuable for the instructor. Again, as I said, in terms of grading for employers and for other faculty, we're helping them sort students to decide who gets in and who doesn't. And then this is the piece I sort of held off on. So what's the purpose of grades for students? So yes, we're giving them some feedback about how they're doing in our class, but it's very vague. It's just a letter. It doesn't really say a lot, right? The grade itself doesn't actually give them a lot of information. They know they're probably doing poorly if they get a low grade, and they're probably okay if they get a high grade, but it's pretty unhelpful in terms of giving them concrete information about what they're learning and what they still need to work on. We need to couple that with feedback for them to get that information. So the other reason we often communicate grades to students, though, if we're honest, I think most of you would agree, is to motivate students. Whether we should or not is another question, but we often are like, you need to work a little harder. You're going to have to do this in order to get a grade. We're going to sort of say, if you don't do this, if you violate these policies, we might affect your grade, et cetera. So we often use grades to sort of nudge students in a particular direction. And that's important for us to think about when we get to thinking about some of the challenges with assessing character in this way. And then finally, the purpose of feedback is to help students learn. It's to help them know in concrete detail where they are not doing as well, where they are doing well, and most importantly, forward-looking, where they can think about, okay, what do I need? What are the next steps I need to take to do better? And so that's an important part of feedback assessment for our students. And these two, the two that I highlighted in green, are the two that are most important for teaching and learning. And these are the ones I hope that in our discussion today we'll get to talk a lot about. I think they often get buried when we're talking about program assessment and program evaluation and research on character education, is thinking about how important assessment is just for the normal everyday practice of teaching and learning. And what I will say here is that this is, even apart from this request that the Educating Character Initiative gave for me to give this webinar, is I will often say in workshops, I will often share these two principles, even outside the context of assessment, which is that one of the really interesting insights from the research on teaching and learning, especially on teaching, there's a scholar who has done a bunch of meta-analyses about various variables that are correlated with effective teaching. And there's like hundreds of them. And in the top 3 is receiving feedback about whether our students are learning. So the point here is that in order to be an effective teacher, the more regularly we have really concrete information about whether students are or are not learning, the better we will be as teachers. Which is kind of obvious, as I said, if it turns out my students aren't learning, I'm going to adjust some things, hopefully. And if they are doing well, I'll make a note of it and I'll sort of reinforce that in the future. And the reality is that a lot of our traditional teaching, our pedagogy, we don't get a lot of information. We do it, especially if you imagine a really traditional course where you have midterm and a final exam, and you're lecturing most of the time. You don't actually know whether your students are getting it, whether your students are growing in the way you want them to grow, until the midterm and then the final. And so the point is that the more that we get regular, every day, every class period, constant, lots of information about our students are struggling here and they're really doing well here, the better we will be as teachers. So that's a reason for assessment, even apart from accreditation and research, is that if we want to do well in our classes to develop students' character, we need to have a lot of information about whether they're learning or whether they're growing. And so it's important for us to devise strategies for doing that. And then secondly, and even more importantly, probably the most important thing I could say about assessment is that it is given what we know about the science of learning, feedback is essential to learning. In fact, I might even go so far as to say that it is impossible for human beings to learn without feedback, without knowing. And feedback doesn't necessarily have to come from a human. If I run into a wall, I know I'm not going to go that direction anymore, right? That's a kind of feedback that is helpful. And that means I've learned something from that feedback. But the more feedback we get, the more we learn. So if we actually want our students to develop their character, they have to get some feedback about how it's going. And again, that may be there are a variety of different ways to think about that, but it is essential. So as much as we might want to say, I don't want to do this research assessment stuff, like actually building in the kind of judgments about how they're doing and reflection on assessment, on their own assessment of their own growth and development is really important to their own learning and development. And so it's hard, we shouldn't ignore it as teachers or as learners. Okay, so processes of assessment, I think this is useful. So we're talking through like, oh, I don't think I can do that, but I think I could do this. So, researchers doing assessment for research purposes, they're doing fancy stuff. Right? Like they're designing experiments, they're getting IRB approval, they're figuring out the relationship between independent and dependent variables, they're doing like fancy analysis. Love them. Awesome. My husband is a social scientist. It's pretty cool, but that is not what all of us are doing when we are doing assessment. So oftentimes when we're doing work for program evaluation or accreditation, we're really just creating reports. And we know that our research design is not going to be as rigorous as a social scientific research study, in part because we don't have random assignment and we only have small sample sizes. There's just a lot of things that we compromise when we're doing pragmatic research. I still think it's research, but it is pragmatic research. And so we're okay with, well, we just have some descriptive data here and we're going to make some hypotheses. So we're not testing hypotheses. We're not like, showing that this is a correlation. We've shown this with multiple studies, and we're just saying, hey, here's some things we've seen in an informal way. We're going to produce a report. We're going to reflect on that. And we're going to say, here's what our hypotheses are about what we think is happening. We have some evidence, if not measurement, we have some evidence of something that's happening pretty well. And I think the same is true with us and as instructors. So we could just imagine that we give a midterm and a final exam, and we just sort of look at the distribution. Hey, it's good. They're mostly getting B's. I'm happy. But we could also do a little bit more investigation where we are looking at which questions are they struggling with, right? Or we give a couple of different assignments and we think, oh, they're really doing well with this assignment and not that assignment. Or we're seeing they struggled with this book or not that book. So it's the kind of stuff that is kind of natural to good teaching, but we don't often consider it as research. But I like to encourage our faculty to recognize that that kind of work of thinking through, students are really struggling here. Maybe I'll make an adjustment, see what happens. That's a kind of inquiry. That's a kind of scholarship where you're thinking about, and we call it scholarship of teaching and learning in some ways, and you can eventually publish it. But even if you don't publish it, you're still engaged in an inquiry-based process where you're thinking about a problem, you're creating some sort of intervention or experiment. I'm going to try a new assignment, and you're going to document, write down what worked and what didn't work. And if you've ever at the end of the semester taken notes on your syllabi and said, I'm not going to do that next time, that's the kind of work we're talking about here that is a form of assessment that helps you as a teacher. That's really important. And it's important for us to do it because it can be easy for that to not happen because we're rushed and we're doing so many other things and we're answering emails. And so taking the time to really be reflective, that's another way to think about this kind of assessment, is it's reflective assessment. To be reflective on our own practice is really important to being a good teacher. So processes for grading is pretty straightforward. It's for all three is pretty much the same, that we're going to get a summary score. This is why this is in the literature called summative assessment, if you didn't already know that. We're basically saying we're not interested in their growth over time. We're just interested in how well are they doing right now, so that when I send it to an external person, I can say, hey, they're capable of doing X, Y, and Z. And it's not always a grade. It could be something else, but it's usually like a final score that can't be adjusted with feedback over time. And then for students, as I said, really important in terms of the process and the structure here is to give them forward-looking feedback. So it's not enough to just say, hey, you're struggling here, here, and here on a rubric, but to also say, here are the things you could do or try to get better in that process. So traditionally, we give assessments. These are often summative assessments. Sometimes they're doing double duty as learning activities. Sometimes they're formative if they're like a step along the way. So, you have a paper, the first paper, you get feedback on that, and then you write the second paper, and the idea is that you're going to get better. But these are pretty traditional strategies, right? You have exams that can look a variety. They can be multiple choice. They can be essay exams. You have papers that you can give, presentations. We have group projects, homework, and homework can be problem sets depending on the discipline, certain kinds of little tasks you can have students do. And I also think discussions are often a way we often overlooked, because we often think of graded practices as the way that we do assessment. But actually, you can learn a lot about whether students are learning by really paying close attention to what's happening during the discussion, by actually engaging them in conversations. And you can also do student surveys where you ask them. Now, that's not perfect data. Students often aren't aware of their learning in a perfect way, but it is correlated somewhat. And so you do get some sense of whether they're learning if you ask them, what did you learn here and how did that go, as they're reflecting on that. Let me just back up here. So there are a number of other kinds of alternative assessment strategies. And I'm sure that many of you have a number of ideas. So this could be, I'm going to give a podcast. I'm going to have them do something in the community engagement where they're working. I'm going to have them do a reflective journal. I'm going to have them talk to a moral exemplar. So this is in terms of, if you've heard of the 7 strategies that we've talked a lot about at Wake Forest, you can think about activities that are aligned with those that may also be ways that you as an instructor can get insight into whether your students are growing or not. We can talk about all the great ideas you have for alternative assessment strategies in the question and answer, because I think it would be really useful to share those with one another. But I just want to give you some broad principles that might help you as you're thinking about in the classroom, again, very focused in the classroom, thinking about how to design strategies that will give you insight into whether your students are learning. Or another way to phrase this is making their learning visible. How do we make it visible to us? And so the first thing that's really important is to clarify your goals. Turns out, and we're going to talk about challenges with character assessment in a bit, but it is especially important that you know what you're trying to get your students to learn or how you want them to develop, because part of the reason it's really challenging to assess things is because we're never quite clear what we want our students to learn. And so it's like, well, maybe it was that thing, but this essay actually doesn't assess that thing. And so the more time you spend being really crystal clear about what your goals are, the easier the assessment process will be. The second piece of advice is really pragmatic, is that it can be useful to capture a baseline. Now, if that starts to sound like too social sciencey and too experimental, don't worry. All I'm saying here is to figure out, this is something a lot of us do in teaching and learning already. What do our students know? What can they do? Where are they when they walk in the classroom? And so in the first few weeks of the semester, if you're teaching now, you can go ahead and do this. Just get a sense of, what are they capable of doing? And sometimes I've even given them my final exam in the first week of class, or I've given them the final paper question, but to ask them to sort of answer it in a shorter way, just to get a sense of what can they do already when they come in, so that then, without doing really complicated social science, I have a paper where I ask them to write about a question they have no business answering, right? Because they haven't been in my class yet. So I just sort of ask them the question early on, and they just guess, right? Or some of them might know, right? But it's actually very informative, because sometimes you're like, oh, actually, they do already know this stuff. Maybe I don't need to teach it to them. But other times they have no idea, and it's fun. They're going by their intuitions. And then you give the exact same assignment at the end, and all you have to do is compare, and you see growth. And so you don't have to be a social scientist to do that. Is you ask them the same thing at the beginning and the end of the class, and you can see how things have changed. So simple way to do this, really useful, is to capture a baseline at the beginning of the semester and then give the assignment again at the end of the semester. So it's like a pre-post test, but if you're a humanist, it doesn't have to be a test. It can be literally anything that you get them to talk about. Also, again, as I said, look beyond formal graded assignments. You can see evidence of learning in almost all interactions with your students. So, conversations you're having in class, if you're having them do group work, try to get them to turn in artifacts or things. And then you have some artifacts that you can look at over time if you ever get excited to want to do that and say, hey, look, they're really struggling in the first few weeks of the semester in their group projects. So it's not even graded, but they're just like writing out what they're doing in their group work. And now I see at the end that they're doing something really sophisticated that is what I wanted to see. And again, keeping track is important there. So one challenge again, this is why social scientists are better at this in some ways, because they're always thinking like, causality, what causes what? But one challenge we have is if you just sort of wait till the end and you have all this data, you don't actually know what thing you did caused what. Like, so if you have special pedagogy that you're trying or experimenting with, like I'm going to try this in this unit, I'm going to try this, I'm going to try to have them read books about moral exemplars. You want to make sure that if you see some evidence of learning there, that you know it's linked to that pedagogy. So just slowly sort of keeping track of like, oh, I saw some stuff over here, and that was right after I did this pedagogical thing. because that's the purpose, right? It's for, at least for internal teaching reflection, is that you want to know which things you did worked and which things didn't. So you have to keep the evidence connected to the behaviors. It doesn't have to be perfect, it doesn't have to be an experiment, but the more you can say, okay, I saw this outcome when I was teaching this way, the better. And that could just be even aligning your assessments and your activities in your syllabus. So you have like a table of your schedule, and you just say, here's what I did. Here's the outcomes that I saw in my students. Again, providing forward-looking feedback to your students is really important, as I said before. And then this is a piece I have not mentioned, is that one really important goal, and this is particularly true, I think, with character development, is being intentional about teaching our students to develop the skill of monitoring their own learning. So you want to get them to the point where it's not just they need feedback from us, but they can sort of watch themselves and say, oh, I'm really growing here. I'm really changing here. And not only that, but this is where metacognition is important. It's also that they don't just know that they're growing, but they know why they're growing. Oh, when I took the time to do X, Y, and Z, that really helped me do this, that helped me grow. And so next time I'm going to take that step. So really building in activities that help the students do their own assessment can be really valuable, and particularly in character assessment because of some of the challenges that are raised. So and then this is just suggestions of some more ideas for classroom assessment techniques. And so again, it doesn't have to be graded assignments. You can do a lot of like, let me just check for learning in class. And if you don't already know this, there's a wonderful handbook called Classroom Assessment Techniques. I mean, it's really like this thick, and it's just like page after page of just like little small activities you can do in class or at home. And it's designed not to be read cover to cover. It's designed to be like, let me flip through and look something up. And then it gives you the context, how many minutes, how you give the directions. So it's super pragmatic. Like you could just 5 minutes before class, find one and just bring it in and do it, probably, because it gives all the details of how you actually operationalize that. And then there's this great website, teaching tools / activities, that actually allows you to sort of structure. I have a 50-minute class, and here's how much time I have. Here's some ideas you can choose from, and you click one and you tell them what you want it to do, what your goals are, and it'll sort of develop it for you. So both of these are really useful if you just kind of want to brainstorm assessment ideas that you can use to get feedback in your classes, or to help your instructors or faculty that you're working with collect data. And that's the other thing I should say. All of this is, I'm focusing on what happens in the classroom, but if you're collecting artifacts, there's no reason you can't roll that up to the program level as well, and eventually share some of those things with the program, anonymize them, so that the program has some data that it can use to, it's not as structured as a research project with surveys, pre-post surveys, but it still could be really useful for the program, for them to see some of the work that your students are doing pre-post, and some of the outcomes from these little activities as well. All right, so the final thing I want to talk about, which really I actually want to talk about with you all. So I'm going to say some things and not have any solutions. And then I want to hear from you how you've been thinking about this and why this has been challenging, and what are some suggestions you have, and you can ask me some other questions. So most of what I've shared so far, I could share about any teaching and learning context, not just about assessing character, right? About assessing in any teaching and learning context. But there are these really interesting challenges if the goals you have are to develop students' character. And so I just want to think through some of those, what's challenging about them, and then open the floor to questions and conversation. So we're gonna have a lot of time, I think. It depends on how much time I take talking about the challenges, I guess. So this isn't unique to character, but maybe it is. So if you're doing research assessment for researchers, it's really hard to design rigorous experiments. We don't have really good measures. We have some, and that's what the equipment and the tools that Jennifer's talking about, that, we do have some measures of character, but even the experts will say, well, they're not perfect and we still need to adjust them in various ways, and they don't capture philosophically what we're super interested in. So it's difficult. It's not like you're measuring like physical properties. And so we're still trying to develop measures. It's difficult to design creative experiments that get a sense of whether they're actually developing. And then just the regular stuff of securing IRB, analyzing the data to draw conclusions. That's just stuff that takes expertise that a lot of us don't have. So that's hard. But it's even harder with character because we don't know how we would measure it. Like, I could probably measure student satisfaction. I'm not a social scientist, but I could figure that out. I just ask them, 5 stars. What do you think of this class? But measuring student development on a character is a lot harder scientifically. In terms of if you've been doing program evaluation work, or even as you're thinking about as an instructor, these same kind of difficulties come in, which is that it's really difficult to know what growth we want to see. So do we want to just see them be honest? Like, what does that look like? How do we operationalize that to see something? Is it something that we're going to see in a semester? It's hard to think about, how do I design activities that will actually cause growth in that? Or is it, because you might actually think, well, honesty is something that develops from a cluster of activities. It's almost like a holistic kind of process. And I can't really get a handle on, like, if I just move this lever, it's going to do that more. Than it's not this sort of straightforward process that sometimes scientific research seems to want us to have. And so that's tricky. Like, what are the things that we think will actually develop their honesty and what won't? Now, one of the things we've recommended at Wake Forest is that you break down your goals to be not just become more honest, but to think about the component parts of what skills and knowledge they would need to become more honest. So maybe they would need some knowledge about what honesty means. Maybe they would need some skills at being able to, so just thinking through what are the skills and the knowledge they need, and then you just assess that. So rather than assessing honesty as like this holistic, complex thing, you actually focus on assessing the concrete steps that would lead you there in learning goals. So that can be tough. And then it's just always tough to know if you're doing a bunch of different pedagogies, which you should, we all are, we're trying new things, which things worked and which things didn't. It's tough if you're doing them all at the same time. It's just a difficult experimental situation. So that's tough. But there's more than just that. It's more than just a technical difficulty. And I'm sure some of you, if I just paused and we could discuss and say, what are some challenges you see with assessment of character? And that really starts to come to the fore when we think about grading, right? Do we grade students on how honest they are becoming in our class? Is that what we want to do? And how would you feel your faculty might react to that? Right? Seems a little somehow, and a lot of our faculty are like, oh, I don't know about that. Like, there's intuitions, something seems a little bit off about that. Like, we want them to develop honesty, but grading them sometimes feels a little bit off. And so one might be, and I have an asterisk here because I think it's an open question, but one might be, we don't want to make their development public. We don't want to like send it to an external body that, oh, they really failed in their honesty in this case. However, the asterisk is there because we do this in our letters of recommendation all the time. Whether we should or not is an interesting question, but we are often sending assessments of character to external bodies when we write recommendation letters. But there are interesting ethical questions here about, is this something that should be private? Is this something that we should make public and send to other people if they're really trying to grow and develop in our courses? But then the bigger interesting piece of grading it is, if we're using grading like we typically do, which is to motivate students, is that these are extrinsic motivators. And it's really unclear whether you want to use extrinsic motivators to promote character growth. Because what you might get in that situation is them figuring out, how do I make the professor think I'm becoming honest so that I get the grade? And that sort of works at cross purposes of what we're really interested in, which is genuine change and growth. So attaching grades to these things can both maybe have ethical issues associated with them, maybe. There's reasonable positions on that. But more importantly, it can lead to that kind of, it can sort of nudge students to be disingenuous about whether they really are experiencing growth and changing over time. Whereas if they have the freedom to say, actually, I just don't find this meaningful, that's more helpful for us as teachers, but they won't do that if they think they're going to be graded more poorly on the basis of that, right? So that's why the grading gets really messy here. And I'd love to hear what you all are thinking about, or what whether you've been grading character development. Another piece, again, is if you're just grading them on whether they know different definitions of honesty, a lot less controversial. Right? It's really if you think that if your goal is broader and actually has a character trait that you're trying to look at, that it gets more messy. And then finally, now you might think, okay, feedback doesn't have a grade, so there's no issue here with giving feedback on, you're not progressing as much as you should with your, honesty. I keep using honesty, but there could be any example, like courage to speak up in class. It could be, your discipline. It could be, I mean, there's a number of things you could think about, whatever your goals are for your class, that maybe feedback is great. That's the perfect sweet spot, because we're giving students information that they need to know to develop, and we're not making it public. And it's, this relationship between me and the students, and that's great. But I actually think this is tricky too, because giving feedback on character is very interpersonally challenging. And so if I'm saying to a student, and again, it depends on my goals, but if I'm saying, like, I just see that you set this goal for yourself, but you haven't been doing very well here on this front, or I saw you do this thing in class that made me think that maybe you're not living up to your goals. That's a different kind of critique than your writing is, could be improved, your grammar could be improved, right? It's an interpersonally challenging critique that really, some of the folks in the Program for Leadership and Character and I have been talking about this, that maybe that really belongs in relationships of deep trust and affection. And it's sometimes hard to build that in teacher-student relationship, at least it's just a one semester kind of thing. Like maybe you're a mentor and that can work. But there can be ways in which it can cause more harm than benefit if the students aren't prepared to hear it and the instructor isn't able to give it in a way that it can be heard. So I think even in that sweet spot of feedback, there are challenges. And so in this case, you might be thinking, well, didn't you say earlier that you have to have feedback in order to learn? And now you're saying you can't give them feedback because, this is interpersonally challenging. And I would say this is where leaning into self-assessment is really important. So if you want them to actually you want them to think about their own experiences. So what happened over the last week? Reflect on that. Think about what worked and what didn't work. There's a way in which they are getting feedback, but it's from themselves and from their life experience rather than from the instructor who has some power over them, which is also important. And so these are the tricky pieces. So, I think there's lots of opportunities for us to do lots of different kinds of assessment. I hope this framework has been helpful for you. But I also think there are some challenges that we face that are unresolved. And so I'd love to hear from you. And at that point, I think that now I'm just open for questions. And I'm going to just close out of the slide deck so that you can see my face a little bit bigger.
All right. Thank you so much, Betsy. I just want to remind everyone, put your questions in the Q&A box and we will pass them along. I have a few already coming in, so I'm just going to dive right in.
Okay.
Let's start where you finished, which is some of the problems or challenges for assessing character in particular. So this is a question that has a general element and then sort of how does it relate to character in particular. So how much can you rely on, or how much should we look to what students think they've learned?
Yeah.
Or how they've learned it as the right measure of what's happening? So this is a question in general, but it comes up in particular in character. Often when people are doing assessment of character in the classroom, they're asking students to self-report or to reflect on. And how do you think about that? How do you do it in a way that's reliable? What are the limitations of that? Just could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a challenge across all learning. If you think about student evaluations, oftentimes there's a question like, how much did you learn in this class? And there's interesting research that students don't always get it right. And in fact, there have been some really cool studies where they think they're sort of exploring different kinds of pedagogies, and students are like, I hated that pedagogy, I didn't learn anything. And then this other group's like, I learned a ton by that pedagogy. And then they do exams and it turns out they were flipped. Like the students who were in the thing they didn't like learned more. And so, yes, so we should be very cautious of this so the main thing I would say is don't use it as your only measure, because and a lot of, especially with this stuff, with character development, you're probably just going to get all of them saying, of course I got better at this thing, because would be weird to say that there's so much social norming associated with it's a good thing to be more honest. It's a good thing to, grow in your development of various virtues. And so I would be careful about it. But I would also say there are ways that you can not make it perfect. So first of all, let me back up and say, even though students don't have a good sense of whether they're learning, it's not totally unrelated from their learning. So there's a correlation, it's just not perfectly correlated. So you're getting a little bit of information. You're just not getting, it's noisy is the way I would put it, like very, very noisy. And so you need more evidence as well. But another thing that can be good, it's good for two reasons. One is it gives you a little bit more concrete evidence, and it also forces the students to get better at their own self-assessment, because one worry is if we're really that bad about knowing whether we've learned, we're not, it's like sort of a false consciousness or something. Like we don't really know, we don't know ourselves very well. And so it can be really useful for them to build the skills to actually be able to have more accurate assessments of themselves. And so one way to do that is to require them to give you evidence. Like, what's your evidence that you got better at that thing? So instead of just saying you did, like, show me. So if you've heard, there's a lot of discussion in the pedagogy literature right now about ungrading, like different approaches to grading. But one thing that happens when you're doing ungrading is you basically meet with the students at the end of the semester and talk about what grade they should receive. So it's kind of radical. You can change, they don't have full say. You can say, no, I disagree with you, I'm going to give you a grade. But the key part of ungrading is that they have to give you evidence of why they deserve that grade with work that they've actually done. And so the more you force them to give evidence, it may not be perfect evidence, but it forces them to give you some things that might actually give you some insight into whether they're learning, but also helps them realize, like, oh, I'm just phoning that in. I actually didn't really get better when I look at what I did at the beginning of the semester and what I'm doing now. So I think that's a sort of short answer to that, or long answer, but
No,
not,
that's
it could be,
great.
I could say more, I guess.
That's great. One more in this spot. So when we think about, well, any learning, it happens over time. Character in particular, we think a lot about this and we're sensitive to this. But tracking students over periods of time has its own challenges, and especially when we're thinking not just about being data scientists, but faculty running our own courses. We have them for a semester, they're in and they're out.
Yeah.
Are there strategies that you would recommend to do the best we can with this? How do you think about this spot?
Yeah, I mean, part of it goes back to setting your goals appropriately. So it's not just figuring out what your goals are, because that's important so that you can measure align with your goals, but it's also really thinking hard about what am I actually capable of doing in a semester, and then assessing that instead of assessing something else. So if you think you can get them to be self-aware, I mean, that's the first step of something. Like if you want them to sort of grow in a certain way, to recognize where they have failures. Maybe that's enough. Start there, right? That's my course, is I want them to see where they are struggling. And that's all. Like, do they know? Are they self-aware where they're struggling? That's good. Or again, the knowledge goals that are associated with the virtues could be important, or even certain sorts of skills. Like, so when I think about the virtue of intellectual charity, or sort of giving, when you think about it in the context of scholarship, like I want my students to take other views seriously. And that's something that I can see in their work over time in their papers, right? Are they actually honoring what the other person said that they disagree with, or are they just like dismissing them out of hand? So again, pitching your goals to be really appropriate for that time period. But of course, you can still have goals that you hope that in 5 to 10 years, when you see your student, that they will also have had more dramatic changes. And so there is this interesting question of, am I planting seeds that will then grow, or is it something that needs to be reinforced over multiple courses? And that's a social science question that, again, our program evaluators can help us with. You could potentially work with your Office of Institutional Research to follow up with alumni of your courses and just see, but it's really just tough to get, as you know, it's tough to get them to respond to things. And it turns out, oftentimes we have this intuition that students, 20 years from now are going to have a different attitude about our course than they do when they're in our course. But oftentimes that's not true when they've done studies that are comprehensive with student evaluations, for example. It's just that the people who come back to us are ones who loved us. So we see like, oh, the person who comes back 10 years later, like there's a reason they came back 10 years later. And so it's an open question, but I think that doesn't, so I guess I'm just saying, I don't want you to lose hope that the work you're doing won't have a long-term impact, but just being realistic that you shouldn't, in the context of your course, be expected to assess that level of change.
Good. Our next question is about working with faculty. So a lot of the people that we work with in the Educating Character Initiative are a team of people who are trying to get some character programming going on their campus. you have some experience running a center, and how do you get the work off the ground? How do you get faculty into doing this work? Faculty are busy. It seems like what you need from them is some sort of explicit, like some commitment to making their goals, their assignments explicitly tailored to certain outcomes. It's going to require some redesign on their part. Maybe they don't like to be told what it is supposed to happen in their classroom. How do you deal with these kinds of issues?
Yeah, so I'm hearing, I mean, there's if you have a teaching center on campus, first thing I would say is get to know them. If you've already worked in the teaching center, great, but like we think about this question all the time. So there's lots of actually literature about how to engage with faculty and some of the challenges. And I heard sort of two concerns in there, and they're very different in how you would respond to them. So one is that faculty are busy. So that's going to have a whole host of things to think about. And then the other is that they're skeptical. Right? They don't want to be told what to do, or they're not clear it's important. So skeptical because they're not clear it's important, or they don't want to do it your way. And those require very different approaches or different strategies for us to working with faculty. And a lot of this is based on the unique cultures of your campus. So it's very hard. I can talk about Wake Forest, but I've also been at other types of institutions where things were very different. And different strategies work different for different campus cultures. And so I just that's a caveat to say, what are the things that are valued on your campus? Are there ways you can leverage those things to help faculty see this work as valued as well? But in terms of busyness, I have found, and I don't know if my colleagues and leaders and educating characters would agree with me, but at least at Wake Forest, one of the surprising things that we have found, and I think that our field is starting to sort of do some research on this, that you might think if they're really busy, you need to provide a lot of really short things for them that are really accessible, like 30 minutes, right? Like you're busy. But we've actually found that that is less successful than really intensive, like 2 full days. And part of that's because faculty are busy, and because they're busy, their time needs to be well spent. Like they're thoughtful enough to say, like, I actually need to get something really meaningful out of this if I'm going to give my time. And it's very hard to do anything meaningful in half an hour to an hour. And so, and also it interrupts their work that is meaningful. Like they like to do things in chunks of time. Like I want to think deeply about this for a day or two rather than an hour. It's just not often how faculty or knowledge work happens. So I actually think if your intuition is to do more workshops or to show up at a staff meeting or something, actually doing like long, full institutes it can be valuable. It's still not going to get everybody, they're busy, of course, if they're super busy. But also acknowledging the time can be useful, easier said than done with like, financial incentives. We have lots of debates about that way for us. Do we have time to do it? Is it a good thing to do? But I think honestly, we've had faculty that have participated even without the financial incentives. And sometimes that's a good thing because it's not an external incentive, like they actually care when they show up to do those things. Now, in terms of skeptical, my one piece of advice, again, I could talk about this for hours, so it's a very good question. I love it, is that I think this is something especially important with character development, if they're skeptical or they have their own approaches, is to lean into that. To actually, instead of resist it, to lean into it, to say that's what we're about. We want to have a debate and a discussion about various ways of doing it. There is no one right answer, and we encourage you to come and have a discussion and to come and have a debate, and let's see what we think, and let's learn together. We're always learning. Because I think if you lean into the model of like, we're the experts, we have the knowledge, and we're going to tell you, it's not going to often work with faculty. But if it's more of a model, we're learning together through a process of inquiry, then they find it exciting because they're like, like, okay, I'm going to come and I'm going to share my position, and then somebody's going to disagree with me, and then maybe I'll change my mind. And so I have found that building a culture that's welcoming of that kind of inquiry and disagreement sort of cuts through the sort of opposition in some interesting ways, because they're like, oh, you're not making me do it. Great. And also can lead them to sort of adopt some things that we're interested in.
We only have 5 minutes left, and we have so many questions. And of course, what that means is I'm going to pick one, and it's going to be way too big for the amount of time. So you're just going to have to choose which things you want to say first. But picking up a little bit on where you just were, so you've been talking a lot in these last couple of questions about how to tailor these to particular contexts or particular kinds of worries, how this would manifest, how to invite the disagreement into the room. how do you think about uh, changing assessment, altering it depending on which students you have in the room, your student population? So in particular, are there cultural differences that you've noticed make a difference for how you would present the information? What if there are sorts of concerns about a way of talking about character in particular? This doesn't have to be about character, but since this is the space we're in, how do you think about the differences in what students bring to the table and what faculty want to bring into those conversations about character in tailoring the assessment to the room?
Right. And so I actually think, and I think this is a good lead in if we end here for your conference that you're doing in December about educating character across.
You noticed that.
Yes, no, and I mean, because I actually think it's a very interesting question to think about, would it change assessment? I think the place that it would trickle down to changing assessment, but I think the place that it would really have the biggest influence is on your goals. So in other words, do you feel comfortable saying, this is the approach to character that we're going to take, these are the virtues that matter, and you're just going to have to develop them, right? Without taking into account sort of cultural norms that I'm not sure, different ways that might manifest, or different kinds of assignments that students in different contexts might be interested in. I think it behooves us in terms of just equitable teaching practices to think carefully about what goals are appropriate or not. So I actually think character education is about ethics in two ways. One, you're teaching ethics, but it also raises all sorts of interesting ethical questions about pedagogy, about how much autonomy we give our students, about whether there's a way in which we're sort of putting the thumb on the scale a little bit too much, such that it veers into the fear of indoctrination. And some faculty may have this fear at your campus, maybe not, depending on your context. And so getting them in a space where you're like, yes, we know these are questions, and we want to talk about them and talk through them, and to recognize that we're often putting our thumb on the scale in a lot of contexts that we don't see we're doing it in higher ed. And so having that big conversation, I think, can be valuable. But I like that this question focuses us on our students and it's basically in some ways their autonomy, right? To learn and to grow in the ways that they want to. And so some things that people will do is that they get to choose the virtue that they develop. That has some challenging pedagogical implications. If you have 7, maybe 20 different virtues that students are developing, that can be challenging, but it may be a trade-off that's worth it if it means the students to sort of have their own agency. And incidentally, if students are choosing it, they're also probably more likely to be motivated to do the work that they need to do to develop it. So, and then you would assess them differently based on what goals they have and what kinds of assignments they want to do, which is aligned with, if you're familiar with the universal design for learning, that all students are supposed to be doing the same kinds of things, but you can adjust the format for different students in different backgrounds. So so I think the assessment would look different in that context, but I think even a step before that is you need to think about your goals and whether they're appropriate for all students in your classroom. And it is 1 minute.
I know. Perfect ending. So you all can see why we're so grateful to have Betsy Barre at Wake Forest. She's incredible. Thank you so much for joining us and for sharing